I give a lot of talks at universities and medical schools and historical societies and civic groups. And there's always a lot of folks like yourselves, history buffs, and they tend to pride themselves on knowing Philly history. And I've written about Philly spies, sports stars, buildings, events, gangs that seem to have been forgotten. And if there were books about them, I never would have delved into it. I just would have read the book. But I always find it remarkable that when I find something interesting, like a whole gang of thieves from Kensington, who were well known around the country, but no one ever did anything serious in the study of them, it's just astounding to me. And as I've told Fred, and maybe you've heard at any of my previous presentations, it's nothing short of remarkable that every year we have another book coming out on Ben Franklin, and there's so many other people events that are never covered. So I guess that's become my niche, and this is another one of those. This is a story that resonated internationally. It got universal coverage. It wasn't just the Philly story between river to river. It was covered widely. Reporters from around the country came here, but yet when I would run into people who thought they knew something about Philly history, they never heard anything about the Klondike Bake Oven deaths. So the event occurs during the summer, a very hot summer in 1938. Temperatures were very high, few air conditioners. A lot of people were suffering. And if the temperature is 90 degrees outside, you can believe it's probably 100 degrees inside. And I can attest to that because I worked in the Philly prisons for 10 years. And especially Holmesburg seemed to intensify whatever the weather was outside. You could count on it being 10, 20, 30 degrees worse inside. And so in August of 1938, we have some very, very disgruntled prisoners, and you have to understand that Holmesburg prison at that time is packed with, believe it or not, 1,500 inmates. As Fred will tell you, that prison was designed to hold about 770, and they did have to keep on enlarging cell blocks, but it basically was to hold 770, and now in 1938 we have 1,500, and you have 3 and 4 inmates in a cell. And you don't hear about it much today, but the inmates had a lot of grievance, and one of them was with the food. And what took place back in the teens and 20s, but rarely today, were inmate food strikes. Inmates deciding to organize, not go down the chow hall, to show their disdain for the food. And so they initiate this food strike, which was nothing new, and about 660 to 700 inmates decide not to go down to the chow hall. Now, this is always a threatening gesture or event for authorities because they are terribly outnumbered. Back in 38, you probably had all of 100 guards and 1,500 inmates. So you can imagine the threat it presents when inmates start to organize themselves. What made this particular event even worse in the minds of the authorities is that it was being picked up not just in local newspapers, but in other newspapers, and it became front page news in the New York Times, the paper of record in the country. So there's a big article about a Holmesburg inmate strike. So you have the inmates not going to chow, the threat they present, and this event is getting large coverage. However, because it is so hot and inmates are so uncomfortable, almost from the beginning, the strike starts to fail, and hour by hour, certainly day by day, inmates start to change their mind and go back down to the chow hall because they want to drink some water. They want something. You can imagine what it's like sweating on a cell block hour after hour when the authorities have cut off all exercise, stopped visits, no phone calls if they were allowed to have any. They were just locked in their cells all day. So the spirit of the strike started to break. The strike starts on a Tuesday or Wednesday, and Friday night, the authorities decide it's payback time. They start taking out some of the perceived leaders of the strike, either those supporting it or those who organized it. And what they did is they pulled out 5, 6, 8 inmates. They took them out of the regular cell blocks and they put them in a separate unit. To the superintendent, it was called an isolation block, but to the inmates, it was called Klondike. They had other names for it, but it was basically the hole. And in prisons around the country and around the world, you always have a hole, a punishment unit, where inmates could get tuned up, beaten to hell, tortured, or sometimes just sit on their ass and wait until the authorities decide to let them leave. But the Klondike had a unique aspect and feature to it, and we will get into that shortly. Could you move to the next slide, Fred? This is the entrance to Holmesburg as it looked in 38. Next slide, please. You folks will recognize this is the southwest corner of Holmesburg Prison. You can see the tower and the formidable walls. And next slide, please. This is an aerial view of Holmesburg, facing the front of the prison with the administration building down below. The two wings to the north and south of the administration building, slightly lighter in color than the others, were built about 10 years earlier because of the overcrowding, because of the periodic violence and problems. They added 2 additional cell blocks, and they also added a very small unit. And if you look to the upper left, you will see the blue arrow that Fred kindly threw in there. And if you don't know where to look and you don't see that arrow, you can easily miss the structure. That is the Klondike. It is a very small building that's about 50 feet long, 15 feet wide, 1 story in height. I'm thinking the ceiling was probably as high as a basket on a basketball court. So it's a tiny building and it only has 12 cells. 1 man a piece supposedly is to go into these cells, and some of these cells are already being used for storage. Not all of the 12 are functional because they have odds and ends and paint cans and ladders and other things in about 4 or 5 of them. On that Friday afternoon and evening, the authorities start to throw inmates who took part in the strike in the cell block, and they start giving them the treatment. The treatment included shutting the air vents at the top, shutting the few windows the building had, cutting off all water, and then turning up the heat. The building had several banks of large radiators, and I don't know why, no one ever found out why, to my satisfaction, why a small building had enough radiation that it could, as I write in my book, it could have warmed the Bellevue Stratford Hotel. So this was a practice that had been going on inside the walls of the prison that the prisoners knew about, but no one on the street knew about. That includes Fred, that includes council people, that includes elected officials. They did not know that this was a isolation unit that morphed into a punishment unit that morphed into a torture chamber. Next picture, please. The heat is turned on Friday night. It is kept on hour after hour. And over the course of the next 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, they start throwing more perceived leaders of the strike in Klondike, to the point that by Sunday morning, they have 25 inmates in basically 5 cells, 3, 4, and 5 inmates in tiny cells. These cells were smaller than what you found in a regular cell in a cell block. The Holmesburg cells were somewhat large, certainly by today's standards. You could throw 4 or 5 in there, which they did. It wasn't recommended, wasn't desirable, but the place was overcrowded. Excuse me. The cells in Klondike were tiny, really designed for no more than 1 person, but the administration couldn't care less. They threw 3 and 4 inmates in a cell, and they would bring out a cup of water and a piece of stale bread each day for an inmate. They shut off the functioning of the toilets. There is no running water. All the windows are closed, and the temperature in there is rising. Remember, this is occurring during a horrendous August heat wave where the temperature on the street is between 90 and 95 every day. So these cell blocks are climbing 110, 120, 130, 140, approaching 200 degrees at the time. And by Monday morning, when the authorities decide to go open the cells and check on the men, most of them are unconscious. 4 of them are dead, and a good many of them are not recognizable as human beings. They looked like they had come from Mars or another planet. They were blue. The inmates had turned blue. And that Monday morning, the coroner gets a call. His name is Charles Hirsch. And the superintendent of the prison informs him that we've had a catastrophe up here. We don't know what's happened, but you better get your ass up here immediately. And the coroner and his staff travel from City Hall up to Northeast Philly. And when they get up to the prison, they see all sorts of mayhem with all sorts of police and fire engines and, hospital lorries and what have you, running inside the prison to try and revive those who are still alive. And it's quite a challenge. Almost immediately, the police, of course, are up there. And what you have to understand, and those of you who have gone back in time and read Philly newspapers or just know the score, Philadelphia was an incredibly corrupt town. If you were a cop who was not on the take, there must have been something wrong with you, because everybody from the corner police officer to the commissioner was probably on the pad of somebody. It was just an incredibly corrupt system. There were investigations by lawmakers, allegations by, goodwill agencies and progressive reform units all the time to try and clean up the corruption. They got some headlines. They never really got any prosecutions or satisfactions or improvement. And that is all an introduction to say that the police investigators who come up there basically say nothing untoward took place, that this was a regular disagreement amongst inmates who decided to fight each other over the issue of ending the strike and going back to the prison and going back to the chow hall to have their meals. And right away, the coroner and his staff are in total disbelief, because they can see that the wounds on these inmates are not from strife. They're not bodily blows, and nothing explains why these deceased individuals look like aliens from another planet. The superintendent and the warden of the prison, his name is Frank Craven. They are stunned by the allegations made by the coroner that something else happened here, and it looks like these men were steam cleaned or roasted in some way, that it was not a struggle, it was not a fight, there was no disagreement over ending the strike and going back to their cell blocks. And pressure is put on the coroner, and he is contacted up at the prison by the mayor to listen to the investigators, the police officers. They are the ones who know homicide. They have been investigating these issues for years. But the two key investigators, one was a Detective Sergeant Martin Curran, and I'm blanking on the other individual's name. They are sticking with their story, and it's being supported by Superintendent Mills and Warden Craven. So you have this disagreement taking place here. The mayor, his name is S. Davis Wilson, who's a very, very formidable political figure. He's an interesting individual in himself. He's not a Philly boy by birth. He comes here, I believe it was around 1905. He's actually born in Boston. He's a New Englander. And something else that folks do not know, and it could be a piece of trivia that you can use, he's probably the only mayor we have ever had who killed somebody. He was in a fight, at least that's what the allegation was, up in New England, and he killed an individual. The investigation into it wasn't too thorough, and there were a number of people who felt something very untoward took place there. But S. Davis Wilson leaves New England. He comes to Philly. He finds a home. He gets involved in the political arena. He's ostensibly a Democrat. He works, I believe it was in the city controller's office. He makes friends. He's quite personable. He's very shrewd. He's very canny. He works his way up the ladder, and he runs for mayor. And he actually is the individual, I believe, who defeats John B. Kelly for mayor back in 1935. But as I said before, he is shrewd and wily, and he wants to run for higher office, such as senator or governor. And he's mulling his options to the point that he's thinking of leaving the Democratic Party for the Republican Party, or run on both parties. He thinks he has the makings of an individual who can do whatever he wants in the political arena. And he controls everybody in the political establishment. He tells the prosecutor, the DA, he tells the police commissioner, who are all under his thumb, that we are going to follow the recommendations, the decision of the inspectors, the police officers who investigated it, because he wants this issue buried. He wants it placed under the rug or under the cell block. He doesn't want any more news about Holmesburg in the newspapers. But as you can see, and Fred, you can move to the other three pictures periodically, this is front page news. It dominates the news. The headlines and articles over and over throughout each page are on some aspect of these murders, showing the deceased. And this one here showing Mills, showing the three individuals. That's Frank Klondike, also known as Eddie Hayes. He actually comes from the Youngstown, Pittsburgh area, and he comes to Philly. He's the only one of these guys who really has a significant record. He's around 45. He's done prison terms in different states and cities. And I think he's in jail for shooting a pharmacist in South Philly while he's doing a robbery. The other two individuals, I'm blanking on their names, but they were low-level guys who were basically burglars who burgled in Frankfurt and Kensington and, Wissonoming and what have you. And they're doing short sentences, like, 5 months to 18 months or 3 years to 5 years. The individual at the top there, Klondike, also known as Eddie Hayes, he is doing a longer sentence because he actually shot somebody. Most of the men in there, most of the 25, are fairly insignificant. You would never recognize their names. But they are subjected to horrendous brutality. And in fact, other newspapers that cover this incident around the country uniformly call it the worst case of prison brutality in American history. That is Holmesburg. This is another newspaper showing what you see there. At the top photo is the corridor of the Klondike, and on the left you see the cell doors. On the right you see the radiators. The bottom photo is an exterior shot of the Klondike, and you can see it's a very small building. You wouldn't be wrong if you called it a shed. So this is dominating news in Philadelphia, in the surrounding area, and it's making headlines around the country. And you can see that Charles Hirsch, and I do give him and everybody else different names in my piece of historical fiction. I decided to take a stab at fiction. I used this story to do it, even though I did an article on it, which Fred tells me I did back in 1995. I had forgotten the date, and you can probably find it on the web. And that article is probably, I don't know, around 2,300 words. The historical fiction, the book that I've done, considerably more. It's 300 pages. So these are the newspaper headlines and the coverage that it's getting. It's going into the individuals. Here you have the actual names: Klondike, Harry Osborne, and James McQuaid. There was one other individual who was found dead. All of them had been discolored. The relatives that were brought down, the two on the right were Northeast Philly guys. Frank Klondike, as I told you, was from Western PA. And he may end up being buried in the Potter's Field in Northeast Philly, because as far as I could tell, there were no family to send the body. So Patty probably has the answer to where he's buried. Next picture, please. Here you have the entrance to the Klondike. You can see how small and modest it is. Next picture. Here's that interior shot, a better view of it. The cell doors on the right, the radiators on the left. Next picture. Every day, there were dozens of reporters and photographers who massed on Tarsdale Avenue. And the superintendent was smart and scared to death. He kept them outside the prison. He would not let them in. The stories were bad enough, but the aspects of the crime and the story were dribbling out. When people who saw the bodies, who worked in the prison, would leave, they'd obviously be asked questions. They tell the reporters, and that's how the initial information is leaking out as to what happened here. Next picture. This is William Mills. He is the superintendent, has a very interesting history. He's born in Upland in Chester County. His family, I don't think it was a mushroom farm, but they had some sort of semi-industrial operation down there. But he was more active, did not want to be in the business. He's pretty physical, and he ends up being in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. He's a cavalry officer. He's known for his handling of horses, big physical guy. And he comes back to Philly after the war, and he's placed, he actually starts at Temple University. He's there for maybe a year, and he may have been the first fullback on Temple's football team. He's on one of the early football teams, and I think he played fullback. But scholarship and reading and writing and studying and test taking is not his thing. So he leaves school, he joins the police department, and he serves on their horseback squad. but he is capable, and he works his way up the ladder to the point that by the late 20s, early 30s, he is the police commissioner of Philadelphia. And so he's quite competent. He does some reform-minded things on the police department. And he is thrown, not to his liking, from the police department to the prison system, because the prison system was always having these periodic riots and demonstrations and murders and what have you. The mayor decides, let me throw Mills in there and maybe he can do something with it. Mills wanted nothing to do with it, but he didn't really have a strong say in the matter. So he becomes the superintendent. Next picture, please. Okay, here we have a picture of Mills and Frank Craven. These are the two key individuals in authority in the Philly prison system. Craven is the real nuts and bolts administrator, operator, go-to guy, because his whole career is in the prison. And he probably was a little bit miffed that he was overlooked and Mills was given the job. Mills was probably happy that he had Craven, because Mills could walk his dog in the prison yard and not be on top of things, because he had Craven to run the show. And this is a shot that we'll get to shortly. It's inside, I believe it's courtroom 653 in City Hall, when something very unusual takes place. Next picture, please. Here is a picture of Mills and without a jacket. The gentleman to his right that he's talking to is Assistant DA Boyle. He is not the elected DA of the city. He's the top deputy. And he's called into this as pressure builds, because Coroner Hirsch, to his great credit, does not follow what the police and what the superintendent and what the mayor wants done. They want this written off as a dispute and a deadly fight amongst inmates, but the coroner recognizes something else very, very bad took place here and that he is going to pursue it. And so Boyle is eventually brought on board as somebody who was going to follow the coroner's lead. Next picture, please. The coroner pursues this case, and he is in the jail before sunup and well after the sun declines, and he and two aides are going cell to cell, interviewing every inmate, trying to find out everything that happened over the weekend running from August 19 to August 21st. He believes that the authorities cooked these men alive. That's what survivors are telling him. That's what he believes has happened, and he's willing to risk his political fortunes on that, as well as his life, because there are death threats that emanate his way. There are those in the city who do not want him investigating and propagating anything other than what the police have said. In this particular case, the individual on the left is Governor Earl of Pennsylvania. Because this event has garnered national and international attention, he comes back from his vacation in Central America. He's visiting Panama and other Central American countries, recognizes that he's got to get his ass back in the fold. So he flies back to Harrisburg, then comes to Philadelphia and does a tour of the prison. So that's Earl with hat in hand. Right next to him is Hirsch, the coroner. Next to him is Mills, and the gentleman with his back to the wall, I believe, is a assistant to the governor. Next picture, please. This is that same corridor with the coroner, the governor, and the superintendent, showing the governor what the cells look like. Next picture, please. Same thing here. Earl asking questions, being told by Hirsch what he suspects happens. Next picture. Here you have them just outside the Klondike building. And that is the gentleman on the left is a individual that Fred may yet write a book about. That's the Secretary of Welfare, Engard, next to the governor who was facing Mills and the coroner. Next picture. The coroner finally pushes through and does something that was rarely done at the time, certainly never against the mayor's wishes. He calls a blue ribbon coroner's inquest. This is all very, very much opposed by the mayor. By this time, the prosecutor has come on board and has Boyle participating, and the entrance to this courtroom was the most desired ticket in town. There were lines in the hallway of City Hall to try and get one of these seats. And as you may be able to discern, if you have very good eyes, all the way on the left facing you, I guess it's second from the end, is the warden Curran, and all the men behind him and alongside him are prison guards, because many of them have been called as witnesses in this. The coroner is determined to ask pertinent questions and try to get these individuals to talk up about how these inmates died and how the practice of cooking inmates alive was part of the culture of the prison. Next picture, please. This is the coroner's jury. This is a select jury of 6 individuals who were chosen by the coroner. These are prominent citizens. You had a state rep, you had 2 women and 4 men. These were generally prominent people. The most prominent was an individual who ultimately had a Philadelphia school named after him, Gilbert Spruance. That may be him with his back to us there. But he was a prominent citizen, Gilbert Spruance. I think he may have been a high-ranking member of the school board as one of his civic involvements. He did not want to do this. He did not want to piss off the mayor, but the coroner leaned on him that this was a very, very tragic incident that has gotten national publicity, and we should do all we can to try and figure it out and give the deceased, the relatives of the deceased, a fair opportunity to find out what happened and those who did it be punished. Next picture, please. This is the jury sitting in their seats. The reason that the photograph is lodged up like this is that I got this from the Urban Archives at Temple, and they had a lot of photographs of this event. Unfortunately, they weren't too well maintained. They're at least 80 years old, and they disintegrate in your hand. This is one of the better ones that you can still make out individuals. Next picture. Here we have a picture of Frank Craven next to some other guards listening to testimony at the inquest. Next picture. And this is a close-up of that. Next picture. Next. Okay, these are no doubt prison guards who have been called down to testify. And I think the individual on the left, his name is Alex or Adam Bro, B-R-U-G-H. I think he lived in Weston-Nomine or Mayfair. And then the third gentleman standing right in the middle, he was important. He was a sergeant. And he gets initially targeted as giving the order to shut the vents, shut off the water, and turn up the heat. And he finally blows the whistle on the entire operation, as he doesn't want to be the one to take the fall for this. Next picture, please. This is a group of women waiting to get into the courtroom, and I suspect by their demeanor that they are wives and possibly mothers of the guards who are now looking like they're going to face some heat for this crime. Next picture. Here is an individual, probably a guard, testifying at the inquest. Next picture. Here we have, again, a couple guards listening in 653. Next picture. And this is the cover of the book, The Klondike Bake Oven Deaths, where you see the aerial shot of Holmesburg and then the cell block at bottom. I think we may have one or two people who have some interesting anecdotal comments about this case.
Another question, were the older prisons closed when the new ones opened, and were they still operating? Sometimes they were, but eventually they would close. Now, Holmesburg prison has been closed since '95. The House of Corrections closed actually in 2020, last year. Kern-Fromhold prison, which was built when Holmesburg closed, that was a result of two Kern and Fromhold, two men who were murdered in 1973 at Holmesburg. Do you have anything on that, Alan?
Just that it adds to Holmesburg incredible reputation, nothing which we should be proud of. All of your listeners and viewers, no doubt, have watched films, some very good ones that focus on Sing Sing, let's say, in the East and Alcatraz in the West. But you can make an argument that Holmesburg's history is as formidable as those. It's just that Hollywood never found Holmesburg. I've now written 2 books on things that are pretty well incredible, that being the Holmesburg experiments, where for a quarter century, a prominent dermatologist and prestige university used inmates as raw material for experimentation. The other story is the one we're talking about, where inmates were cooked alive. And then I was working in the system and at the prison the day when officers Warden Curran and Deputy Warden Fromhold were killed, attacked by 2 inmates of the Orthodox Islamic faith. And that's the only time that's ever happened in American penal history. So there's a lot of things that have happened in our prison system that we shouldn't necessarily walk up and down the street with a flag, but we should know about it and maybe try to learn from it.
Another question, is the Klondike building still standing?
That building was taken out, as best as I can discern, around 1969, 1970. I know that through the fact that I started working in the Philly prisons in 71 and knew an inmate who was actually convicted of killing a bank guard in Northeast Philadelphia around 1968. And he told me that one day he and about a dozen other inmates were taken out of their cells. They were given blackjacks and hammers and all sorts of heavy tools and told to destroy the building. So that building was up from 1930, it was built in 1929 and finally taken down about 1970 in that area.
Somebody asked, why write a fictionalized instead of a straight account?
Well, that's a good question, and the best answer I can come up with is that I thought I would give fiction a try. I have a number of friends who are very accomplished historians. They are professor emeritus at different universities and have made a name for themselves in the area of World War II espionage, Soviet espionage, the Cold War, and they have tried to write fiction. They couldn't do it. And I guess it was more of an intellectual challenge to see that if I could do it and get a publisher and have it accepted. And so far, the reviews have been fairly decent, and no one has told me to leave the fiction to Hemingway, or they've thought it, but they've been too kind to write it. So that's basically the reason that I gave it a shot. And I think people and bookstores will tell you that more copies of fiction is read than copies of nonfiction. People generally, in my biased view, want to be entertained. They don't want to be educated. That's why this group here that has plugged in is pretty unique, and appreciate their interest.
I have found Richard Abraham. Richard,
Excellent.
Are you there?
Hello.
Hello, Richard.
Hi. Thank you for, Alan asked me to join the group today because my father, Hans Abraham, was one of the 3 prison doctors at Holmesburg in August of 1938. But before I get to that part of the story, some of you may know he was a doctor in Mayfair with an office at 3353 Cotman Avenue at the corner of Cotman and Crispin. He bought that building in 1939 or 1940 and had his office there until about 1985. It's still a doctor's office. I think Dr. Alex Ye owns it now. My dad sold it to him in 1985. I was born in 1945, and the family lived in that home until we moved to Cheltenham Avenue near York Road and Cheltenham Avenue in 1948. But my dad was a family doctor, made house calls. I went with him in his convertible Chevy Impala with his black doctor's bag on house calls in Mayfair. And he had a lot of patients and loved that neighborhood. But he was born in Germany in 1910, went to medical school in Germany. He was Jewish. His parents realized that things were not going well for Jews in Germany, and so they sent him to the United States in 1934. He did an internship at the old Jewish hospital at Broad and Olney, and that's where he lived in 1935 and I think into 1936. One of the first jobs he was able to get, because he was not yet a citizen, because he hadn't been here yet for 5 years, was as one of the 3 prison doctors at Holmesburg Prison. It was his full-time job. He worked like Monday through Friday. And I heard the story about the deaths and what was going on at the time and his fear from him. And he wrote like a one-page sort of his own recollections of what happened. He probably wrote that in the 1950s or 60s. And it's really fascinating. He writes that he left work on Friday afternoon. On Monday morning early, he got a phone call asking him to come back to the prison immediately, that there was an emergency. And when he got there, he found there were 4 prisoners who had died. There were 21 others that were close to death, that he worked for 50 straight hours at the prison because nobody would allow any of the prisoners to be taken out to an outside hospital. He worked furiously to save their lives, by giving intravenous fluids and other supportive care. And fortunately, all 21 of those that he worked on did survive. But he was worried that because it was not only in the national press, but in the international press, what had happened at Holmesburg Prison. And my dad's parents were still in Germany, and they read in the German newspapers about alien doctor being implicated in deaths of American prisoners. And they were in the process of trying to be able to get out of Nazi Germany in late 1938. And they sent a telegram to his home, which he didn't receive because, fortunately, while he was a doctor at the Jewish hospital, he had helped care for a woman who had a baby whose family was also from the same town in Germany that he was from. And he became very friendly with that woman's father, who was a very, very wealthy man who lived on Rittenhouse Square. His name was Leo Heimerdinger. He had a car, a butler, a chauffeur, a cook, a maid, and his family that lived in a big apartment on Rittenhouse Square. And he was aware that there was the coroner's inquest about what happened at the prison. And so Leo Heimerdinger agreed to, sorry, I get emotional about this. Leo agreed to hide my father in his apartment until he could hire a lawyer for him to clear his name that he wasn't working over that weekend. It had nothing to do with the deaths of the prisoners. So because he wasn't at home, he never got the telegram that his parents sent until about a week or two later. And when he finally got it, he was able to contact his parents, and they were successful in coming to the United States early in 1939. But he never forgot what happened at the prison and how worried he and his parents were. So Alan, I've read about half of Alan's book. I happened to get it through the wonders of Amazon 2 days ago, and I've read about half the book. And I really recommend it. It's a wonderful read, and it's a great story. And
how much did I say I would pay you for that, Rich?
Pardon me? The privilege of you're going to sign my copy of the book. That's
I will do that. But yeah, I am really glad that you reached out to me after seeing the review in the Chestnut Hill Local, because this is really a compelling, story. Here's somebody who, can relate what happened, and it was so precarious for him. And people can't really, even though I just explained it, and you saw some of the newspaper pages, it just dominates the news every day, page after page. And in one edition is on who the inmates were, who the relatives are, the background of the superintendent, the history of the prison with riots and breakouts and what have you. And it's very understandable how anybody's name being associated with being a potential perpetrator or accomplice or whatever would be scared to death. And somebody like your father, look at the lousy choices. He's either going to be thrown in Greaterfurt as complicit, or he's going to be sent back as an immigrant to Nazi Germany. So it certainly was a precarious, place for him.
And one of the things that Alan really talks about in the book is the rampant anti-Semitism in the 1930s, all over Philadelphia, as well as I'm sure many other places, which I'm sure added to my father's fear of what might happen to him.
Yeah, it was certainly a different city and a different time. But let me turn it back to Fred. Do you have any questions?
Well, on the doctors, I remember reading some of the newspaper accounts. They were supposed to visit the Klondike anytime anyone was in there. They were supposed to once a day visit those people,
right? And
they were not allowed to during that weekend.
Correct.
And that was one of the reasons your dad Hans got off, if you will. That they finally realized that he was not implicated. He wasn't allowed to do anything.
Right.
Was another strike against those who were making these decisions, not allowing the doctors who were mandated to go in there, and yet were not allowed to. Had the doctors gone in there on Saturday, they would have seen what was going on and stopped it, but didn't happen.
Right. One of the things he wrote in the one-page recitation of his memories was that there was a regulation in the prison that the doctors are supposed to be notified anytime any prisoner was put in the Klondike, and they were not notified. Yep. And I think one of the other doctors, Dr. Enoch, he was actually working on Saturday and had asked to go to the Klondike, and we refused permission.
Yeah, that's right. What people have to know, Fred, is that the Klondike had this interesting rule. I don't believe it was written, but it was understood that if the Klondike is inhabited by an inmate, a doctor would have to see him every day, which somebody who's spent a lot of time in prisons here and around the world, very unusual, and leads me to believe that the culture was an operation where inmates either got tuned up physically, which means a hell of a beating, or they gave them the heat treatment. And because an individual could succumb from either, that it was recommended that a doctor see them, and if they were in such bad shape, they should be taken out. On this particular weekend, as both you and Rich point out, Enoch, one of the doctors working the weekend, asked if he should go visit the inmates in Klondike, and Frank Craven, the warden, said, no, I'll let you know when it's okay to go. And that doctor, instead of asking again or pursuing it, ended up going home at noon, and the inmates received the treatment throughout that day, that evening, all that night, and the next day. And that's why you had 4 dead and many others who nearly were in the same state.
Another question, and thank you, Richard. We've got a couple of comments here about thank you for sharing your memories and your dad's story, and we really do appreciate it. Were you in? Was your office in Mayfair? Are you a doctor, actually?
No, I'm not a doctor. I'm an attorney.
Okay.
I always thought doctors worked too hard, but I found out, being my own boss as an attorney, I worked harder than anybody else.
Right.
But Dad kept his office at 3353 Cottman, just 2 blocks from Frankfurt Avenue, until 1985.
But you should point out, Rich, that he was sensitized by that incident, and that almost was the end of his prison work. I think he told me the very next year he left prison employment.
Yeah, I think I'm not positive, but I think he worked there until maybe the summer of 1939, which is when he bought the property up at Cottman and Crispin and opened an office there. The office was on the ground floor, and he and his wife and his parents lived above at the top 2 floors.
Another question: was the Klondike ever used again? Do you know, Alan?
I don't believe there were any inmates ever placed in there again. The governor, when he came to see to tour the Klondike in Holmesburg generally, he was appalled by what he saw and what he heard. I give a pretty lengthy account of what he said, and they're basically his actual words in the book. And they're fairly compelling, and I thought very well put together. He either was that emotionally moved by it or had been thinking about it on his flight back. But he was appalled, and he had to state if they could not take over county prisons, he was going to have the state police and others in his administration check out county facilities. And the message was sent out loud and clear by him. And then it would have to have been enforced and agreed upon by the mayor and the superintendent that never again would prisoners be put in Klondike. That would be the end of roasting inmates as a punishment. So I don't believe inmates were ever placed in there. I think for all the rest of the 30 years or so that it was up, that it was probably used as a storage facility.
Question: were there any instances before 1938 where anyone died at the Klondike?
Not that I am aware of, and not that I found in the newspapers. There are many instances of inmates saying that they were given the treatment, they were cooked alive. There were allegations of inmates going crazy and then being taken out of the prison and sent to Byberry. I have an account of that in the book. I found that as well on my book, Acres of Skin, which is much better known, dealing with the experiments where inmates were so damaged by some of the chemical warfare agents used by the U.S. Army and CIA that they were taken out to Byberry, and allegations that some died. I could never document it, so I didn't really stress it, put much verbiage on it. But no, I don't believe anybody died in Klondike prior to that August 38 incident.
Were all the prisoners in the Klondike that day, 24 of them, I think, white?
Yes, they were all white. The prisons back then, as opposed to now, were majority white. I don't believe the prisons became minority dominated until the mid-late 60s. I know when I go there in 71, it's about 85% black, about another 10% Puerto Rican. White's a clear minority, but back in the 30s, it would have been overwhelmingly white, and all of the strikers and those thrown in the hole were white.
What happened to the officials that were found guilty?
Well, that is a key part of the story, and maybe I should tell them, Fred, that you and I are going to keep that secret so that they have to buy the book. But I will tell your folks, since they're loyal members of the, society here, that there were a series of trials. The superintendent, Mills, is cut loose. What the inquest and the other trials proved, that was fortunate for him, that he basically was an absentee landlord. He didn't know what the hell was going on. He never knew that inmates were being cooked alive. He left his warden to run the show, and he was becoming increasingly disinterested. Not that he was interested in the first place with running a prison. And so a lot of things happened he wasn't aware of. It's one of those classic cases where the boss doesn't know what's happening because he has subordinates who are more officious and dictatorial. And he seemed comfortable with that, so he was let off. Frank Craven, he could not use that excuse because everybody was afraid of him, pointed to him. And he is found guilty. Initially, he and some others were charged with first-degree murder. Then it's dropped to second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and then involuntary manslaughter. And this is part of the corruption of the Philly judicial system at the time, where there are numerous successful efforts to lowball the charges against those officials deemed guilty of this. And he's finally found guilty, I believe, of involuntary manslaughter and gets a sentence of basically a year to 3 years. And that also happens with, I think his name was Charles Smith, one of the guards. Also gets a similar sentence, very minor sentence. And this is all happening very quickly. The incident, the murders take place in August of 38. By January and February, you start to see trials, which was typical then, certainly not now. And 2 individuals go to prison. Mills loses his job. Interestingly enough, the individual who becomes superintendent of the system is the head of the medical department there. There were 3 doctors who worked there, 2 in addition to Hans Abraham, George Enoch, and the top man was Baldy, Frederick Baldy. Some of you may know that name. It's a somewhat honored name, certainly in South Philadelphia. I think Baldy Funeral Home is still up and running. 2 Baldys, I believe, were in the state legislature. Frederick Baldy was a physician who goes to the University of Pennsylvania. He serves in the First World War. He comes back, and I think he has a street practice, but also is a part-time doctor in the Philly prisons. He then becomes a full-time doctor, the head of the department, and he was much thought of at the time. And instead of hiring an experienced warden or superintendent, they placed the doctor at the head of the prison system, and he remains the head from what I can tell from 38 until he leaves in the early 50s to become the warden of Rockview State Prison in central Pennsylvania.
Okay, that is pretty much it. A number of people have said thank you very much, did a great job. Is there anybody who has an experience about Holmesburg Prison that they might want to?
I just wanted to say, speaking of Frederick Baldy, he, back around 31, the superintendent of prisons had died suddenly, and they had assigned Frederick Baldy to be the superintendent of prisons at that time, a job he did not want, told them he did not want, and they told him he was taking it anyway. And he said, as soon as you find someone that is suitable, please replace me, which they did with Mills. They replaced him with Mills. And when Mills was fired, they brought Baldy back. And again, it was not something he really wanted. But, and he was the doctor, the head doctor for all the prisons and the superintendent of prisons at a single salary. So
Okay.
You can see where there would be problems with the prisons. You know, when you have someone doing that kind of work, because at that time, Mensing was still open and, you know, it's just too much for one person, obviously.
Tell them about the prison part. Were you involved in
Oh, and yes, and he was the one that started, which I had done a talk on before, the Philadelphia County Prison Farm. That was his baby that he started up in 1931, and that closed in 1968, the fall of 1968, after he had left, like 15 years after he had left the Philadelphia prison system.
Adrian Olson. Adrian, there's Adrian. Hi, Adrian. I'm going to ask you to unmute. I'm asking you to unmute. You need to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Hello, Adrian. Yes, we can.
Yes.
Hi, first of all, thank you, Alan, for the invite.
Thank you, Adrian.
I just want to say this is very interesting because this is the first time in my life that I actually had to hear such a story coming out of Philadelphia where white people did such a horrible act against white people, because I was waiting for someone to say, yeah, they were all black. You know what I'm saying? Because that's what I'm used to hearing. But of course, this was way before my time. And, you know, some people just don't have and never will have any type of decency or respect towards human life. You understand what I'm saying? And I come from a different side of the story because I'm the daughter of an activist. I don't know if y'all knew my father, Leotis Jones. He was one of Albert Kligman's lab rats out of Holmesburg prison experiments. And that took I'm not going to get into it, but that was an experience for me as a child. It was a horrible experience because I was there when he came home after those treatments. But this was a very interesting coverage. Alan, as always, you deliver. I'm just learning you, and you're a very fascinating man to me. I really enjoyed this Zoom meeting, and I'm looking forward to participating in more as I begin to become interested in more of the history of Philadelphia.
Let me jump in a second, Adrian, and tell Fred and Patty and others that your father, Leotis, was one of the active inmates in the 1960s who did take part in the experiments. He received chump change in giving the doctors a little piece of his skin here, there, and everywhere. But later on, he would really get active, and Adrian's father, Leotis, testified in Washington at the hearings regarding the Tuskegee syphilis study. Senator Kennedy held hearings in, I think, December of 1973, and they started to learn that there were other places besides Tuskegee where vulnerable people, the emotionally disturbed, institutionalized children, adults, unwed mothers, all sorts of people, folks with learning disabilities were grist for the research mill. And Leotis Jones and another inmate named Alan Lawson went through the experiments in the 60s and testified in Washington. And Leotis was active in a lot of prison reform initiatives from the time he got out of prison until he died a few years ago. And now it looks like his daughter Adrian is picking up the flag and carrying on in that regard. And there may be others, so I don't want to take up too much more time, Fred, and there are other people.
Yeah, I think we've kind of reached the end, but that's another, your book on acres of skin is something we should discuss.
Yeah.
And thank you, Adrian.
For anything at this point, those experiments.
Yeah.
Adrian, I'm really sorry for what your father had to go through, and sorry for all of those that had participated in that experiment. And Alan, you did write a fascinating book on the subject. Again, I recommend to anyone to read Acres of Skin. And I'm looking forward to reading your new book. I did know about the Klondike bake oven and tragedy. And it's just horrible to think of such really horrendous things, happening within our city, and to have gone undocumented for so long. It just reminds us that we need to be aware of what, everything that is going on. Things that are kept hidden should be open to everyone, so that tragedies like this do not happen in the future. That's for sure.
No, that message, Patty, is absolutely important, that folks, even average citizens, have to be vigilant.
Just to point out that Patty is our chief cook, and we haven't had any refreshments for over a year.
You go to her house tonight?
She's the cookies and cake person. When we were at Pennypack Baptist Church every first Wednesday, she had a tremendous spread of.
Did they come for the food or the talks?
I think quite a few of them came for the food and enjoyed the talk, but a lot of us enjoyed both. And I hope we get back.
It was a nice way to stay around.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. I hope we get back there in September. I think if everything runs to, who knows? But that's
may I point out that Patty, in addition to being an excellent cook, is an excellent historian.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're going to wrap this up. We'll be back.
Greg?
Yes.
Can I make
this
is a little off subject, but I was a member of the GAR board, and I know some of you guys may have heard that we were trying to move. We're actually considering buying a property up at 8110 Frankfurt Avenue.
I have been in discussion with, talking with Joe Perry.
Okay.
About that, and showed him around. That would be
if
fantastic.
anybody that knows that, if anybody wants to lend us support or has some concerns, they can contact the GAR.
There are plenty of us that want to do that. That's going to be a great opportunity. Lots of history in Holmesburg, and this is going to be an opportunity to centralize it. A great location. Hope it works out, Tom.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're going to sign off here. We'll be back in May 5th and be discussing Rawhurst, the neighborhood of Rawhurst. If some of you were with the Adam Levine talk a few months ago, he kind of covered the bottom of Rawhurst and Sandy Run, which goes into Pennypack Creek, and we were talking about the Holmesburg waterworks at that time. We'll have some more in-depth coverage of Rawhurst in that area up between Ron and Pennypack Creek on up to Fox Chase down to the boulevard. Okay, Nice
Thanks,
seeing
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you,
Thank
Alan.
you.
Good
Absolutely.
night, everybody.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Good night.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night.